Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Madam to the two members who made their maiden speeches today, the member for Horncastle and the member for Christon, and I think that, no disrespect to the member for Horncastle, I think we're all going to miss Sir Peter Tapsell and his view of history. And I hope that all his recordings have been kept for posterity so that we can understand what a catastrophic mistake Afghanistan was, according to Sir Peter Tapsell, and I agree with him on that matter. The budget we've just received today is the first Tory budget for a very long time, and I've been here long enough to remember the last Tory budget. It's a bit like this is the land that time forgot. It's exactly the same narrative of cutting taxation for the very richest, making life worse for the very poorest and selling off state assets to pay for it all along the way. And I think it's time that the Conservatives' strategy was significantly challenged, and there's a number of points I wish to challenge them on. The first one is this really strange statistic that the Chancellor brought up, that Britain spends 7% of the world's welfare budget, way above, as he claims, the average of every other country. He may be unaware of it, but many countries in the world have no welfare budget of any sort. There are large swathes of Africa and Latin America where there is no public assistance for people in poverty or desperation. It is a ludicrous statistic plucked out of the air and then used to justify a quite appalling attack on many of the poorest people in this country. I long for the day when, as a Chancellor of the Exchequer who gets up to introduce a budget in the way that very few have in the past, which says the priority is to have an expanding sustainable economy with sustainable jobs in an environmentally friendly way, and to eliminate poverty and destitution at the same time. We had none of that. We had all this anti-benefit narrative, as though there's nobody sleeping on the streets of Britain, as though the number of children growing up in desperate poverty isn't increasing day after day, as though the number of young people unable to do homework because their bedrooms are too crowded by their siblings, and all the other issues. Please.
Extremely kind. Yes, and I wish him extremely well with his Labour leadership bid. I'd be happy to support it where I'm a member. Would the honourable gentleman join me in welcoming the fact that the number of children in relative poverty declined by 300,000 over the last 5 years? Would you welcome that?
In fact, the Chancellor has changed the method of calculating poverty in order to produce the statistics he wanted in the first place. And I think he's doing extremely well on statistical changes, and I admire his gymnastics in those areas and that matter. But this is a budget that is essentially an attack on the poorest by the benefit changes that are being produced, and an attack on young people. What is it that the Conservatives and the Chancellor have got against young people? We start off with a third child onward policy. Now, what is that about? If the Chancellor is saying that children deserve to be supported through child benefit, I guess we all agree on that, then why does it stop after the second child? So if a family happens to be 4 or 5 children, some of us come from families of 3, 4 or 5 children, are you saying the 3rd, 4th and 5th child is less valuable than the 1st or 2nd? It is outrageous what's being suggested. Of course I give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Does my honourable friend agree that this budget is a particularly bad budget for Londoners? 2/3 of Londoners on tax credit are actually working. And so far from encouraging people to go back into work, this budget is a particularly cruel attack on working Londoners.
Indeed, my friend is absolutely correct. And the idea that because London has very high property prices and a number of extremely wealthy people in London, indeed it is the centre, sadly, of some of the world's very wealthiest people, it also has appalling levels of poverty. Some of those people in desperate poverty are indeed being forced out of London by a combination of the high rents and benefit cap, and the benefit cap is now proposed to be reduced. Now, I'm not pleased that we have to spend £25,000 or more on supporting some families. But the way this statistic is presented by the Chancellor you would imagine, or one would imagine, that the entirety of that £25,000 goes immediately to that family. No, it doesn't. It goes straight into the pockets of a private landlord, just as much as the in-work benefits often go to subsidise low wages. Now, I'm pleased we're getting something approaching a living wage. It's not actually very far different from what the minimum wage would have been by that time anyway. So I think we have to look very, very carefully at the issues surrounding this budget, and in particular the other problems for young people, such as the cuts in benefits, such as the inability for them to access housing or to get a reasonable level of room rate if they're single, and of course the continuation of the low wage rates for young people and the conversion of all grants into loans for young people from poorer backgrounds who are hoping and planning and aiming to go to university. What is it the Conservative Party have got against the young people of this country? I find it very, very strange. Now, on the issues of housing, I represent a constituency that has about 40% council tenancies, about 30% social private rented, and about 30% owner occupation. Because of the very high rents in the private rented sector and the benefit cap, many people are being forced out of the community. The same thing is happening all across central London. And those that say it doesn't matter because they don't represent a London constituency should think on. This principle could apply everywhere else. And so the Chancellor's proposals on housing are very interesting, because at the first off, he does nothing to address the problem of housing shortage. The problem of the lack of council housing being built, the problem of the lack of... No, I won't give way a second time. The problems of the lack of building of sufficient numbers of housing association properties, or indeed the number of places that have been built for reasonable sale. So his solution, the Chancellor's solution, is to force councils into right to buy with an up to £100,000 discount, £100,000 discount, force councils to sell off what they call high-value property, because high-value property shouldn't be owned by the local authority. So we have the ludicrous situation in my borough where my council, to its credit, is building homes, building flats. It's just completed a development of 25 new flats. If the Chancellor's proposals go ahead, nobody on the housing waiting list, nobody in housing stress in my borough will get those flats. They'll be sold on the open market to anyone who is able to buy them. What does that say to those people in desperate housing need that want to maintain communities in London or any other part of the country? And then the sale of housing association properties. Housing associations are quasi-independent. They're not the government's to sell. I'm concerned at the financial model of housing association, which has gone from, at the time of their foundation, a almost 100% level of public investment in them for the construction of new properties, and gone down and down and down, so they become effectively building companies with using private finance to build. Now, there isn't a problem in borrowing private finance to build, but there is a problem if the rent model at the end of it, or the building for sale, does nothing to address the housing needs of the most desperate people in this country. So what we're doing by stealth is privatising the housing associations and by forcing them to sell off their properties. So what happens to young people who can't afford to buy, there's no bank of mum and dad, can't afford to rent? Where do they end up living? Why is it that we have the highest age anywhere in Europe of people being able to leave home and live independently, and it's getting higher and higher and higher? This budget offers nothing to those people in housing stress, and then whilst being very keen on regulating what local authorities have to do by A, increasing the rents for those on higher earnings, and B, decreasing the rents for others, with no remarks about compensation of the housing revenue account for the income that's lost by that lowering of the rent, and yet says nothing about regulation of the private rented sector and the astronomical rents that are being charged in some parts of London. In my constituency, to rent a two-bedroom flat, you need to pay £350 a week, at least. To rent a house, you need to be paying £500 to £1,000 a week to rent a house. Completely out of any kind of scale that most people could even think about being able to afford. Very briefly, a couple of other points I wanted to make. The levels of tax evasion in Britain are high, and I'm pleased that the Chancellor is prepared to address the issue of tax evasion. But why a non-DOMs for 15 years? Why not abolish the non-DOM status altogether? And why not, as part of the EU negotiations, consider the question of the tax evading loopholes that exist all over Europe? We have some islands around our shores where tax rates are remarkably low. Switzerland managed to charge remarkably low rates of corporation tax, as does Luxembourg, Liechtenstein and Monaco. Should we not be looking to close down all of those loopholes? And so instead the Chancellor proposes yet another cut in corporation tax and says the way forward is to continue the race to the bottom in lowering corporation tax. The last 2 points I want to make are that we are proposing in this budget a very long journey from the hugger-husky days of the Prime Minister and the promise of being the greenest government ever to the sale of the Green Investment Bank to the private sector with what kind of requirements on its future performance, I know not, because nothing is made very clear about that in the Red Book. The cancellation of at least 2 major rail electrification projects which were trumpeted before the election and used as part of an election-winning strategy to show the Conservatives had really got it on railways and really wanted to see railways expanding. Instead, they cancelled the Midland Main Line electrification and the Manchester to Leeds electrification. Is the Western Region electrification safe? There are many other projects that one begins to worry about because of those announcements. And at the same time, investing a huge amount of money in road building. It's as if the whole transport strategy has now been turned on its head, and instead of going for the more environmentally sustainable rail transport, particularly for freight transport, we are now once again on a binge of road building in a country that is already rather too polluted, and there's rather too many vehicles on the road. We should be surely trying to rebalance our economy in favour of sustainable transport. I'm not saying get rid of all cars, obviously not, but I think we have to be more sustainable in our transport policy. Yes, I do give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. In terms of the green credentials of this budget, it is also in the Red Book that renewable energy will be subject to the climate change levy. Which is utterly perverse from the point of reducing carbon emissions. Would you not agree?
Well, indeed. I hope there's going to be sufficient opportunity to question the Chancellor on the whole environmental strategy behind this budget, because I really, in an era when climate change is a serious problem around the world, air pollution is a very serious problem, particularly in India and China, but it's also a growing problem in London and other cities, and surely we need to have quite a big thought on the health effects of this and the role in which a financial strategy can be used in order to improve our environmental standards. I asked the question about how all this is going to be paid for, and I turn to pages 28, 29 and 30 of the Red Book, which say all the public assets that have been offered up, totalling £30 billion in this financial year. The highest ever sale of public assets ever in the history of this country, and almost double what Margaret Thatcher achieved at the height of her privatisation mania. And that comes from, well, the members opposite say more of it. Of course they do, because that's the only economics they can think of, is getting rid of public assets in order to fund tax cuts for corporations and to pay for the inheritance tax cut, which will largely benefit the very wealthiest in our society. Now, I won't give way because I'm conscious of the time and I want others to be able to contribute. And so the BBC has been persuaded, willingly or unwillingly, to pay £150 million for the over 75 licence fee, 40 billion selling of shares in Lloyds Banking Group, 20 billion fees from Lloyds RBS and UK, sale of Eurostar, sale of Royal Mail, sale of remaining shares in Lloyds Bank, and I mentioned the sale of the Green Investment Bank, even for goodness sake the sale of the King's Cross Property Development, which did such a great job in developing King's Cross into such a wonderful place that it is, and of course the sale of the remaining RBS shares is a trick of mirrors and a trick of smoke and mirrors at that. It hits the It hits the poorest. It does nothing to solve the housing problem. It creates greater inequality in our society, and it's paid for by the sale of public assets, which we should all be able to benefit from. And I hope that one day there will be a government in this country that sets as its priority, its commitment, to reduce inequality, to get rid of destitution and poverty in our society, and bring us about a society more at ease with itself, rather than the inequality that is the only message that the Chancellor himself seems able to offer us today in his speech.
Maria Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to follow the